Kia ora, I'm Bruce Munro. With me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman. And this is Global Insight. This week, US President Donald Trump tweeted, "If Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran." For many ordinary citizens around the globe, it was a shocking surprise, seemingly coming from almost nowhere. Welcome, Robert.
Good evening, Bruce.
There seems to have been a dramatic shift in the US attitude towards Iran. What's changed?
I think, in a word, the Trump administration has come to office in January 2017 and essentially moved away from the Obama administration's approach, which was based on the idea of global security. The Trump administration have gone to this American first ideology, which is essentially hostility towards multilateral security arrangements and looking towards bilateral or unilateral arrangements, which are perceived by the Trump administration to be in their interests. And so as part of that readjustment under the Trump administration, the United States walked away from the Iran nuclear deal, which was painstakingly negotiated by the Obama administration, and also France, Germany, Britain, Russia and China, as well as Iran. And they are all the signatories. Now, the deal hasn't collapsed because the United States walked away from it, but the Trump administration now seems to be applying what it calls a policy of maximum pressure on the regime in Tehran, probably with a view to stimulating regime change if possible.
There's this heightened tension between the US and Iran. What's the latest on the situation? What's going on there?
Well, it's very worrying and very dangerous because in your introduction you quoted Mr. Trump with his belligerent rhetoric. I don't think we should get too worked up about that. Mr. Trump likes to engage in those sort of playground exchanges, and as we've seen with Kim Jong-un, that he could result in a love-in a few months down the track. But I think what is worrying is the actions the Americans are taking. For example, the Americans have dispatched the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier with a strike force, plus a bomber squadron. This is a very tense area. Iran is a major player in the Middle East. And I just think the prospect for miscalculation in such a situation is quite considerable. And let's be quite clear, this confrontation between the United States and Iran is not just between those two countries. The Europeans and the other signatories to the Iran nuclear deal totally reject Mr. Trump's position. And they think it's unrealistic and it won't work. And in a sense, we're now seeing the alternative that the Trump administration always had in mind to the Iran nuclear deal. Because one of the things that the Europeans argued with Mr. Trump is, if you leave before the Americans left the Iran nuclear deal, what are you going to put in its place if you leave this? Well, what seems to be putting in its place is a strategy of maximum pressure where the Americans expect the Iranians just to cave in. And I'm not sure that's going to happen. And there's a real danger here, Bruce, because Iran is a country of a lot of young people. About 60% of people in Iran are 25 and under. And we want to, the Western world wants to encourage gradual change in that country. It wants it to move away from a less clerical regime to one which is more representative of the wider population in that country. And at the moment, Iran is acting as a bit of a troublemaker in the Middle East region. So we want to encourage democratic change in that country. Mr. Trump's position will probably boost the position of the hardliners in Iran. And in a sense, the hardliners in Tehran feed off the hardliners in Washington. They are pointing to the Trump's position, and we now have members of the Iranian regime actually criticizing the Iran nuclear deal, whereas before they'd been very supportive of it. So saying that we shouldn't have trusted the United States.
Does New Zealand have any skin in the game in this dangerous situation?
Potentially, yes. Iran used to be a very important partner for New Zealand in the Middle East. We've had an embassy in Tehran since 1975, and we still have an embassy. As I said before, it's a large country, 80 million, rapidly growing. It's got enormous potential wealth. And for an agricultural exporter like New Zealand, a potentially important partner. In the 1980s, Iran was, I think, one of the biggest export markets, in the top 5 of New Zealand's export markets. It's now descended in terms of export destinations for New Zealand products, but I say potentially it could be an important link for us, and we are certainly affected by the confrontation that's rapidly developing between Iran and the United States. I think New Zealand's position is very similar to that of the EU. That is, New Zealand was in the Security Council, and one of its proudest moments, according to one New Zealand official, is when it was able, when it was in the Security Council, to fully endorse the Iran nuclear deal. So we don't share Mr. Trump's approach to the Middle East. And what we've got to keep in mind, Bruce, is not just the US approach to Iran that New Zealand disagrees with. New Zealand also disagrees, as does the EU, with Mr. Trump's approach to the Middle East generally. For example, Mr. Trump seems to be walking away from the idea of a two-state solution to the conflict, long-running conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Mr. Trump seems to be dividing the Middle East into good guys and bad guys for him, and Mr. Bolton, his hardline national security advisor, the good guys are Saudi Arabia, Israel, and to a lesser extent Iraq. Although it's not sure, given the Shiite links between Iraq and Iran, should a confrontation develop, I'm not sure America will be able to 100% depend, at least the Trump administration, depend on Iraq. So that's an interesting one.
What forces are pushing towards war and which are holding it back?
Well, I don't think Mr. Trump necessarily wants war. There's a degree of bluff going on here. Remember, he had this sort of exchange with Kim Jong-un. What he expects is for the Iranians to pick up the phone, ring him at the White House and say, Donald, can't we get together and sort this little spat out? Then I think if the Iranians requested a one-to-one meeting with the president, I don't think he'd turn it down. But, the Iranians are very upset about the fact that America, in their view, unilaterally walked away from a negotiation which involved compromises on their part. Remember, the Iran nuclear deal was where the Iranians effectively foreclosed the possibility of developing nuclear weapons, at least for 15 years, in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. From their point of view, in the words of the Iranian foreign minister, the United States has dishonoured an international agreement which involves 6 parties. They believe they're in no mood to pick up the phone and to, charm Mr. Trump. So as I say, it doesn't seem to be too much room for manoeuvre at the moment, but the Iranian situation is potentially desperate economically. It looks like the economy it will shrink by about 6% this year, thanks to the intensified sanctions by the Americans. These are unilateral sanctions against Iran. And in addition, inflation's around about 40%. So, it is a potentially very dangerous situation.
Do you think Donald Trump recognises what's happening there in Iran and is hoping that that will cause unrest within the country?
Yes. I mean, what he's hoping is that, there's widespread signs of discontent in Iran, and there has been for a long time. I think the clerical regime hasn't got popular support. But, to be fair, Iran is one of the more democratic countries in the Middle East, and they do have election shocks. Ahmadinejad, over a decade ago, won a shock election. He wasn't expected to win. So they do have an election process which is credible by local standards. But there's no doubt about it. It's a two-tier system where the clerical establishment is also entrenched. The supreme leader at the moment is an Ayatollah. So, that's, in a sense, I think there's a fair degree of dissatisfaction with the clerical regime. And a lot of Iranians are unhappy about Iran's involvement in the Syrian civil war. The calculation by the White House is if they put maximum pressure, they may sort of incite a popular protest or get the regime overthrown. But, the experience of Iraq should be a cautionary tale for the United States. There was a feeling that the Iraqis would be grateful when the Americans took direct action in Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein. They were far from grateful. They wanted the end of Saddam Hussein, but they didn't want the Americans to rearrange the furniture. And I think one of the dangers here for the Americans is that a lot of people may be very unhappy with the clerical regime in Tehran, but American pressure may actually force them on a nationalist basis to rally round the regime. So it's a dangerous game the Americans are playing, in my judgment.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Huda Hafiz.